Hello everybody and welcome to a new session of Q&A Your Time. In this video I will feature, as announced, some of your ideas and suggestions you left after or in the comment boxes on the video I made recently, Music of Your Time. You remember that's the video that I posted on last Friday, I think, after making a recording of a new sonata by Kostas Papazafaropoulos, a C minor sonata, which got a very good response, so I'm really happy with that. And then on Wednesday I had a Skype call with Kostas, and on Friday I released a video, Music of Our Time, in which I basically expressed the idea, or maybe even my opinion, that looking back to earlier styles and researching them, not only for the fact of researching them, but for recreating those styles today, might be something that is an activity, so to say, that we may call as well an activity of our time. Because looking back to what was in the past and recreating it is something that we maybe even do more than we think. Like, for instance, copying of old or earlier styles instruments, like I'm playing on a clavichord. And if you see behind my back, there is another one, and it's not the Joris Potfliege clavichord. It's the Joris Potfliege clavichord, but it's not his own instrument that was here a few weeks ago. It's another one, and I will talk about that in a future video. It would be too much for today. So copying all these styles, and more than that, researching them and recreating them, and again within the limits of those styles finding an own voice, which some of the people I know are doing great work in that, is something that's not really accepted today as a very serious style. It's the so-called neoclassical style is not being played often in public concerts, and that's a pity. It's not easy though to recreate earlier styles, and if you like it or not, composers today, musicians today would like to recreate those styles. They have to compete with the best that was written in the 18th century or in the 19th century, whatever style you feel comfortable with in copying. And that's something we cannot escape. We know the music of Mozart, Beethoven, Bach and others so well, and we kind of forgot that also in those times there was a lot of music that we do not play today anymore, or is not played as often, and sometimes even also for that music is not played as often as it should be played, because maybe the 19th century was focused on the big names, and for a reason. I mean, it's not by accident that Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and others became the standard composers of today. But it's something else than saying that in the 18th century, music that we are not familiar with today anymore is not worthwhile sharing or playing. And all that said, to show you that today, if someone composes in that style, he or she needs to compete with. There's no escape from competing with those composers. So it's not easy. It's a huge task. And if it succeeds, I think it's a pity that it isn't played more than it is today. So what have you written? I start with the last one. Milanus Margus wrote, although I don't share completely the idea of having exhausted all the possibilities in music writing, looking outside of the classical world, for example, can be enlightening on some aspects. I agree on the fact that writing in an historical style should not be seen as an easy choice, both from a philosophical and technical approach. If someone mostly listened to Mozart, for example, it's natural for him to write in a language close to his, and it takes a lifetime to write music seriously and with personality in such a style. Today's problem is a lack of a living, and I have to press the button, more information, is the lack of a living classical codified tonal language. Yeah, a lot of interesting aspects here. That the fact that it is not easy to write in that style, that's something we really should take seriously. And I think I call that in a good sense the establishment world within the music world. So the people who are in charge, actually, who make programs who make programs for opera houses and big concert houses, they should recognize that composing in that style, if it's done well, it's really difficult. It's really difficult because you have to understand, and but that's written here as well. Today's problem is a lack of a living classical codified tonal language. I understand it as that when Mozart was born, he happened to be born with one of the best professors or music teachers in Western Europe, Leopold Mozart. So that was a luck of history. But from his childhood on, he was immersed, I think it's the right word, in that language of the music of his time, which is the style that we like today. And so for him it was not a matter of studying earlier style, it was just composing what he was taught day after day. And so everything they did was historical, was within the style, and that's something of course very different today, and that's one of the elements that makes it so complicated today to write in that style, is that we don't live anymore in a world with only one language, one style, and that's the problem. Maybe also the challenge. So Michael Zweige, he writes, and that's an easy one, I fully agree with your thoughts on that matter. So nothing to add to that. Okay, then we go to a very interesting idea of Adam Frese. He writes, I disagree strongly, which is wonderful. Strong disagreements really lead to new ideas and insights. So, and he expresses as follows: most of all with the claim that the musical possibilities have been exhausted. So that's the part he disagrees with strongly. Especially when looking at the last century, there is such a diversity of new ideas in classical music like none ever seen before. Personally, I found a lot of promise in microtonality. It can extend the possibilities within any genre. Check out the music of Aaron Andrew Hunt to see what he's written in a neo-Baroque style. I've done that, and I will share with you now some footage of a YouTube video on the C major prelude of Bach. So basically, Adam, if I understand what you're saying, is that within that language there is more to be explored. And as we could hear, and actually for me, I was kind of familiar with the term microtonality. I was not diving into that before you mentioned it, so I looked it up. For me, if I listen to the Prelude and Fugue of Prelude of J.S.Bach, it might be different in his own compositions because there it is the composer's language. But here, to me, and I say that with all respect, it sounds to me as an instrument that's really out of tune. And the reason for that, I know it's not out of tune because that's the point of microtonality. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, microtonality is actually a kind of new music language. You could say it's a different one. I would say it's a different language than we are used in Western Europe or in Western music in general. It was developed, if I have read well, in early 20th century, but based on influence from abroad, from Indian music, and brought into our language, which basically means that you divide one tone not in two semitones, but in more divisions, so microtonality. So one the tonal difference between C and D is not divided in two by C sharp to D, is divided in much more gradations, so that you have this, these subdivisions. But to my ears, again, it sounds as an instrument that's really out of tune, and that's because my ear is trained by music that I've listened to, and that's kind of tonal style where from one tone to another you have this division with one semitone, and if you go under that, I feel as if I have to turn with my tuning hammer the tuning pins a little bit to go up to this semitone. So we are programmed, so to say. That's the 1 + 1 story is 2. This is 1 + 1 is actually 9.95, and and I would say that should be 2. But so it's a new language, and you can say that it's a step outside of the Western music model as we know it for centuries, but that's another discussion. So if you see this within that style, within that tradition, or outside that tradition. Then we continue to Eduardo, who writes, very interesting subject. I'm very far from knowledgeable on the subject, but my guess is 2 possible reasons why there is such a stigma to works in a former style. It could be a style develops sophistication and can grow very, very complex. On the other hand, the audience needs surprise, yet develops a growing immunity to changes in the parameters of the style, which could be very strongly coupled, if not cause effect. So revisiting means dealing with a harsh public on one hand and raising the bar to others and the profession on the other. And the audience would then expect more of not only the style but quality of the work. What I take from that is that indeed the audience, what Eduardo was saying, the audience might be the big challenge. I don't know if that's the case. I think that if, again, this upper establishment layer of music world, again in a good sense, would just program those works and make a good selection, because that's essential, that would make a good selection. It should be quality. I think the audience would love those works, really. So John Kyung-ki writes, while I don't necessarily think that everything in music has been done, I agree that composers like Kostas and Michael, and maybe myself in the future, could be judged for the quality of their work, regardless of style. That's an interesting point. I think a lot of the problem is that people tend to look at music on a linear timeline and that no one can rival the great masters. But there is obviously an audience for this music, and as long as an audience exists, people should be able to write whatever kind of music they like and their audiences likes. But because really there is a finite amount of Mozart or Bach compositions, and since people still connect with this music, it's almost necessary for new music in the style. Also, Michael Anton told me about getting a community of classical style composers together, and I strongly agree, because I found quite a few people who share an interest in writing in the style, and composer forum sites tend to be very cynical of neoclassical composers. Yeah, might be the case. So I think as well that writing in an earlier style is something of today. It's actually emphasizing this, and the quality of the work is really important. And I've said also in the previous video, I got a lot of questions to play works, and I only do that if I really connect to the work, and that doesn't mean that the work is judged by that being good or being not good. It's just the connection needs to be there, and it's difficult. Even with Costa's music, in the beginning I had to take my time to connect with that, because it's strange. If you've never considered playing that music, it's strange in a way that we are programmed to what we expect to hear. I mean, if you play a work of Costa's and you've never dealt with the fact that there is neoclassical music in that style, it feels a little awkward, because it's not Mozart, it's not Schubert. Our mind is just trying to find the spot where to fit that music in, and that's not possible because it's a new voice. So that's something that needs time. So I can only encourage online forums for that. That's a good thing. If there is a kind of awareness that it's not easy to write in that music, that all attempts are okay, of course they are, but in order to succeed on a larger level, the music needs to be very, very good, with no mistakes, with a very good voice, with a very good expression, and everything you can imagine. So that you have these different layers of quality, actually, all accepted on the internet, because that's what we're doing today. But I think the upper layer, the very professional ones, should lead, and it should guide actually the way towards the larger audience. So Bastard Tube user, he said, I reckon it can never all be said in any form of music, but that by necessity of a coherent, meaningful expression, the form itself is quite limited. And he continues by saying that he will never get tired of hearing fugues, allemands, corons, and so on. And that he's referring to fiddlers of Scotland, Ireland, and Nova Scotia have free range in writing in the coherent form. I don't see why any keyboardist living today that's informed should have any shame in bringing life to the forms. Yeah, that's the same question as I pose myself. Why shouldn't we be accepted that? Then David is writing here. He's answering to Milanus. I feel we have passed a living classical codified tonal language because highly talented men centuries ago exhausted the permutations that can exist within the code. Still, much can be done while stretching the code or enhancing it with new or outside inspirations. I greatly dislike hearing music compartmentalized, that's a difficult word, or politicized. For it is in music that I am able to escape from the world's demand that I conform to its compartments and politics, especially when you consider that my whole belief structure as a whole seldom aligns with popular views on virtually any matter. As to Wim comments, that's an interesting part, maybe. It's difficult, David. As to Wim comments, but we have had a mail conversation on this already. I know David very well. As to Wim comments, I really believe that music should transcend personal opinion and the restraints of headstrong people who wish to place the idea of music in a box. I told Wim once before that the definition of music is not what most people would define it to be. I believe that the central definition of music must revolve around it is interesting. If it's not interesting to you, it's not music to you, and you should move on, and God be with you. If one does find something interesting, then how dare anyone tell you that what you are enjoying isn't music or isn't worthy? I think, therefore I am. I'm interesting, therefore I'm music. Yeah, that's a really interesting contribution, and David and I, we know each other through mail rather well, so we sometimes continue our conversations in the YouTube comment boxes, so it's interesting. But what he's saying makes sense in a way. I would say, however, that to box music in certain styles and doing that, I understand it's a kind of individual right to like what you like and to dislike what you dislike, what you want to dislike, where you just don't connect with as well as with others, styles or things, whatever. But having said that, we do live in a time and where things are boxed, and maybe that's something of all times, because imagine a world where you have no styles, with no definitions, with all individual expressions of individual subjects or individual humans or individual artists or whatever. It's a little bit the 19th century idea, late 19th century idea. We had also here in Belgium and Holland a kind of movement of poetry and writers who said the most individual expression of the most individual ideas, which was of course the enhancement of the human being as the center of everything. Maybe a little bit we came by that idea in a time today where we are actually a society of an infinitive number of individual human beings. And how great that is at one hand. On the other hand, we cannot escape from the fact that when we go to an opera house, we go there because we want to listen to an opera. It makes sense though. And the idea of putting things in boxes is also a normal way to organize what we are doing and to be on top of that. And so on a deeper level, and that's where I want to come, is that neoclassical music is boxed in a corner where I don't like it to be. And as much as I dislike the fact that it's being labeled like that and it's being treated like that, as being a little bit regarded as not really art of our time, how much I dislike that, it is a fact. And by that fact only, it has an immense influence on the way not the way you and I perceive that music, because we have the freedom to say whatever we want on that music written by Costas or other composers. But that's that's holding back the spreading of this music to a larger audience. Because when we would label that music as being very worthwhile listening to, it would gain access to a larger public. And I think that doesn't contradict what you're saying, but it might be an important element to notice. And to your second point, that if music is interesting and if it appeals to you, you like it and you keep it, and if it's not interesting to you, of course you reject it. But also there, we should again not consider the fact that once things have been labeled and once a society has accepted that label, it's very difficult to escape from. And so the point, I think, on a larger scale, is not whether you like it or I like it. It's whether you and I, or we, find interest, and more than that, find value and find beauty in that, and the wish to share that with a larger audience. That's actually one of the basic elements that drives an artist. That's sharing things he sees or she sees, feels, or get connected to. Sometimes see it from another perspective, and that's the interesting part in sharing. And so the sharing part, that's the reason why I share this on YouTube, is because that's so in line with what an artist does and feels. And so in order to share that with more people, again on a larger level, the establishment, organizations, and again in the good sense of the word, that needs more effort than just liking it or find it interesting, and it needs an awareness, creating an awareness, and kind of leading with good works, as I was telling a few minutes ago. So I thank you all for your contributions, which was nice to read, and I'll certainly do this more often, not every week, I promise, because that would lead us to lengthy videos as this one was. But it is interesting to have this conversation with you this way or just in the comment boxes. You know, I appreciate that always. So I thank you for doing that. I thank you for watching and listening this video until now. Apparently you're still listening. And thank you for subscribing, sharing this video with all your friends. You know, that's important for the YouTube algorithms. And we see each other very soon again. Bye.